Hi, we're out on the range today, so please bear with gunfire you hear in the background. Today we're talking about cleaning firearms. This is a topic which many people have asked me to address, and I've been very reluctant to do so for several reasons, primarily two. One, because it's going to be boring and tedious, and two, because this topic will generate so much hate mail. So, to alleviate some of that hate mail, let me start by saying that I am not trying to tell you how to clean your firearm. I'm demonstrating how I clean mine. I'm not trying to tell you what kind of equipment to get. I'm not endorsing any type of equipment. I'm only demonstrating what I use. I'm not endorsing any products. I'm only demonstrating what I use. Nothing I say today should be inferred as any kind of recommendation. So that having been said, let's start with some of the equipment that I use. Your cleaning kit should all be in one package or container. Some people will use some kind of Tupperware container. A fishing tackle box is a really good thing to have. I use my military issue M16 cleaning kit, to which I've added a few things. I like this because it can attach to an LBV or the outside of a pack, and I typically carry mine on the outside of my pack, so if my CLP leaks, it leaks on the outside, not the inside. So let's take a look at some of the things that are in here. I've got sections of cleaning rod and an eyelet, bore brushes in various sizes. This bore brush can be very useful, and I'll demonstrate that in a few minutes. A cleaning brush, CLP, and in this section of the pouch, I have Q-tips, pipe cleaner, and some cleaning patches. I want to take a moment to discuss some of the different products I use for cleaning firearms, and there's primarily four. First is CLP, and according to the label, CLP stands for Cleaner Lubricant Preservative. Second is Hoppy's No. 9 powder solvent. There's lots of good powder solvents out there. I use this one because it's readily available by local stores, reasonably priced, and it works. Third is 409. There's several household cleaners that can be very effective in cleaning your firearms. 409 is a good one. Simple Green can be used on some firearms. But you must be very careful in using household cleaners on your firearms. Let me tell you an anecdote. A while ago, a colleague of mine and I went to a big black powder shoot rendezvous. This particular colleague, which was not Joe, he's done quite a bit of shooting, but not so much black powder. Now, the way black powder firearms are traditionally cleaned is with soap and water, then you dry them thoroughly, and then oil them. And that's what we were doing, but he noticed a lot of people at the rendezvous using 409. And he was asking me if he should use it, and I told him, no, don't use it. But all of them are using it. No, don't use 409, just soap and water. But why are all of them using 409? That's what they're doing. Don't use 409, just use soap and water. So does 409 not work? It works, but don't use it. Just use soap and water. And there was a very specific reason I was telling him that. Well, he gets home, goes to the kitchen sink. He's going to clean his black powder firearm, and then he notices sitting there is some porcelain cleaner. He figured that ought to work, and yes, it worked. It cleaned his firearm so well, it cleaned the bluing right off it. And the reason I'd told him not to use 409 is because I knew him well enough to know that if I told him to use 409, he'd find some 818 and use that, which he did. You have to be very careful about what household cleaners you use on your firearm. Now, fourth on my list is plain old soap and water. That's what I've got in this container right here. Dish soap can be very effective, or just bar soap, provided that it's ivory. I don't like to use other brands of bar soap because you don't need those added chemicals or perfumes. Your firearm does not need to be springtime fresh, and it's not glad that it uses dial, and your firearm does not wish everybody did. Now, that having been said, let's disassemble our A1 platform and actually start cleaning it. So I've got my A1 platform disassembled and I'll start cleaning it, but I have to preface it with three things. One, I'm going to reiterate that I'm not trying to tell you how to clean yours. I'm only demonstrating how I clean mine. Two, in preparation for today's presentation, I fired a couple of hundred rounds through this without cleaning it. You can see it is filthy. And three, because we're going through this as I clean it, I can only go through this once. So I can't do a lot of retakes, so you're going to have to put up with my Shatner-esque pauses and my very annoying habit of transposing words and syllables. So that having been said, let's get started. A thing about M16 series rifles is that a great deal of residue will collect in your bolt carrier group and in your upper receiver group. And that residue can get hard and crusty and difficult to get off there. And so to alleviate that, you keep this rifle very well lubed. I keep a bottle of CLP in the stock, and I make sure this rifle is always well lubed, and it will keep all of that residue in solution that you can then clean off. Now let's take a close-up look at the bolt carrier group. Here's your bolt carrier group, and here's your charging handle. And as you can see, the charging handle is filthy. And so I'm going to put it in the soapy water. And then I'm going to get my brush wet and get some soap and scrub it. Now the question comes up, why am I using soapy water and not powder solvent? And the answer is because, as I was taught in basic training, you can't use powder solvent on M16 series rifles because the powder solvent can do a lot of damage to the aluminum parts. There are many people who will disagree with that point of view, but that's the way I learned it, and that's the way I still do it. And because this was so soaked in CLP, all that oily CLP keeps the residue in suspension, and it's now easy to clean off with soap and water as the soap breaks down the CLP. And I'll use a Q-tip to reach in here, just like so. Get some of the places that it's harder to reach with the brush. And then I'll just throw that in the soapy water. Now with the bolt carrier, you can see that it's very oily with CLP and very dirty. And I'm just going to put it in the soapy water, get some of the gross matter off it. And then I'm going to just clean it with soap and water. Dish soap, as I said earlier, is very effective, but I'm doing it today with bar soap just to show that bar soap can be effective too. And I'm wearing this particular blouse because I don't want to get all of this stuff all over my very nice hunting jacket. And again, I'll use a Q-tip to reach the areas that you can't reach so well with the brush. I'm also not going to be cleaning it as meticulously as I often would, just because in the interest of brevity, I'm hitting the high points. Now there are some important things about cleaning the bolt carrier. Inside here, you can have a great deal of difficulty cleaning that. And depending on your cleaning brush, you can get it in there. And you can get some of that out. But what I often end up doing is pushing a patch in with a section of cleaning rod. This section here is where a lot of residue will build up. And it has to be cleaned. It has to be gotten out of there so that you can maintain proper working order of your rifle. And sometimes I'll go through several cleaning patches to get this satisfactorily clean. A lot of people will use Q-tips. Q-tips end up becoming expensive, and it's wasteful to use too many of them. You can see after just a couple of cleaning patches, it's already much cleaner. Now, cleaning right here can be very tricky. That's where the pipe cleaner comes in. Never put a Q-tip in here, because you will end up breaking off that Q-tip, and then you're in a lot of trouble. And the pipe cleaner can clean very well. Something else that I can use here is I can just spray this with 409, which is also very good at cutting grease, getting rid of that oil. I can scrub a lot of that off, and that can be very effective at cleaning your bolt carrier. You'll also notice about now that my soapy water is getting very dirty, and so pretty soon I'll have to trade that out. It doesn't do you any good if you're just putting all the dirt back on the rifle. The pipe cleaner can be used here. So now I'll trade out water and we'll clean some more. Now let's work on our bolt. I'm going to do something that by textbook you probably shouldn't do, and that's use the firing pin to push out the extractor retention pin. This is a very important part. Not that there's any unimportant parts per se, but if you lose this little part, it's all over. I'm going to put that in the soapy water where I will be able to find it later. Occasionally people will ask me about keeping an extra firing pin on hand in case they break one, and that might not be a bad idea, but if I were to recommend any part that you should keep as an extra, it would be the extractor retention pin. Also, you have to be careful that this extractor spring doesn't fall out. So again, I'm going to use some soap and water, and I'm going to scrub that with my brush and make sure that this is clean. This is one of those small parts that you have to pay extra attention to. And then I'll throw that in the soapy water. Now the bolt itself, right here, you get a lot of residue buildup. And sometimes it can be very hard and crusty. And even though I keep a lot of lube on this, you can see that some of that is stuck. So I'm going to switch to my bore brush, get it wet, get it soapy, and use that to scrub this off. And again, I'm doing this in an abbreviated manner just to show the technique. And there's a lot of residue that can be stuck to this. And without enough lube, cleaning this part can become very difficult. Sometimes I'll even use the edge of the handle of the cleaning rod to get some of the more difficult pieces off. We'll clean the rest of our bolt. And again, with the bolt, don't put a Q-tip in it. Straighten out our pipe cleaner. Anywhere you buy cheap tobacco, you can buy these pipe cleaners. And we'll use the pipe cleaner to clean the inside of our bolt. And you can see it coming out where the firing pin normally would. And that. And we can also use some 409 on this. Now, does anyone remember about the gas rings? That's a trivia question. What are the only 3 things in the Marine Corps that are not covered in a line? The gas rings on your M16 series rifle. And then we'll throw that in the soapy water. Now, some of these other pieces, they're not as small as your extractor retention pin, but they're still small. And great care must be taken when cleaning them. We're on the range right now, but you can see how cleaning in the field would be difficult. And even if you're at home cleaning in your rec room or your kitchen, you can lose little parts like this. All right. Now, I'm just going to leave these parts in the soapy water for a while, and let's work on our upper receiver. Your upper receiver on an M16 rifle has a lot of intricate places that are difficult to reach. There are times when it occurs to me that the rifle was designed like this for the sole purpose of frustrating me. Other people tell me that's not true. And again, I can spray some 409 in here. It'll help clean some of that out. Now, in cleaning the chamber, oftentimes I'll use Q-tips, and you have to approach these from different angles through your ejection port and reach other parts of the chamber. cleaning the chamber can be very difficult and time-consuming. Also, down here by your gas tube. And many people will consider such things irrelevant, but your rifle must be kept clean. The newer generations that have a gas piston instead of a gas tube will not have as much residue buildup. But on this generation of rifle that has a gas tube, detailed cleaning and plenty of lube is extremely important. Now I'll also take one of these larger cleaning patches and I'll do something similar to what we did when cleaning the bolt carrier. And we can see that there's just a lot of residue in there. Sometimes people will be concerned about getting your rifle overly wet. You must make sure that you dry it thoroughly and lube it appropriately afterwards. But getting your rifle wet is not dangerous in and of itself. I've used these rifles in very rainy conditions many times. And when I was in the military, soap and water was considered an authorized cleaning agent. Now, give me a moment to put my cleaning rod together and we'll clean the bore. Now I'm going to clean the bore of this rifle, and I'm going to do so and starting with the brush, and I'm going to go from the chamber to the muzzle. There are a lot of people who are of the opinion that it doesn't really matter what direction you go, and some rifles like a Winchester 94 or a Marlin 336 are built in such a way you don't have much choice. But in this case, because this rifle will allow me to go from the chamber to the bore, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to get my bore brush wet, get some soap on it. And once the brush is out of the muzzle, I'm going to take it off. Now in this case, the cleaning rod came apart before the brush came out, but that's okay. And it's not necessary to use the bore in the brush dozens of times. Just a few is enough. Because this particular brush fits into the rod really tightly, it comes apart where it comes apart. And this can be a time-consuming, tedious process. Remember at the beginning I said this would be boring and tedious? Yeah. Okay. And now I'll put on the eyelet, which has a cleaning patch. And we can see that spews a lot of dirt out of the barrel. And that's now fairly clean. There are people who will make their own patches out of various things, old sheets, old clothing, whatever. And that can be a practical thing to do. I find for me, it's just easier to buy pre-made patches of the right size. There we go. One more patch. And now our bore is pretty clean and dry. Now I've gotten a lot of soap and a lot of water on this rifle, and I've rinsed all the soap and the 409 and so forth off, but it's still fairly wet. And that brings up the question, how am I going to dry it? And there's a few different ways. Today is a sunny, warm day. That's lucky. And so what I'm going to do is take these parts and just set them out in the sun to dry. At home, sometimes I'll set those in front of a space heater. So I'm just going to set that off to dry. And now I'm going to work on the lower receiver. Now here's an interesting part of the lower receiver, is this opening right here. Now this is obviously not an integral part of the functioning of the rifle, but because in the field you're setting the butt of the rifle down on the ground, you can get a lot of dirt and a lot of mud in here, and you can get some rust, and you can get a lot of stuff in there. So again, we're just going to clean this with soap and water. And it's important to make sure that you get this open and clean around the inside of it, because there's a lot of dust in there right now. And dust won't necessarily hurt it, but dust gets wet, dust turns to mud. That mud will hold the moisture in there, and you end up with rust and other problems. After cleaning this, I'm just going to rinse it off. Generally speaking, M16 series rifles won't get a lot of residue into the trigger assembly, but you still have to clean this. And I'm going to do that with my brush and with soap and water. People will ask about disassembling the trigger mechanism. Generally, I'm going to say no, don't do that. It's something we always considered armor level maintenance. And yes, some people did that. But for the most part, I'm going to say that I don't. I have done it a couple of times, but it's not a typical part of PMCS. And I'm also going to clean the mag well. You can get a lot of dirt and grime in the mag well. They can make your magazines more difficult to put in and take out. Push the magazine release so I can reach this part. I'm also going to clean the inside of the pistol grip. I'm going to get all of this just scrubbed. And then I'm going to come over here and just rinse it off. And then come back over here, shake the water out, and leave it in the sun to dry. The buffer assembly, just going to wipe that off. The action spring, you can really get wrapped around the axle cleaning this, but again, it just needs to be wiped off. And after that all sits in the sun to dry a while, then we'll lubricate it. Now our rifle sat out in the sun long enough that it's dry, and I'm going to take some CLP and put on one of our larger cleaning patches and just put a light coat of CLP on the action spring and a light coat of CLP on the buffer assembly. And then I'm going to put those back into the stock. Then I'm going to take the CLP that I normally keep in the stock, put it back in there. Now let's take a close-up look at lubricating the bolt carrier group. I'm going to take my cleaning patch with CLP on it, and I'm going to put a medium coat of CLP on the outside of the bolt carrier group. And then I get to the part where we have to remember that I'm not prepping this for an inspection, I'm prepping it for use. I'm going to put a drop in here, move that forward, put a drop behind that, these holes right here, I'm going to put a few more drops in there. I'm going to put one drop right here. I'm going to work that action a few times and put a couple of more drops in there. It is possible to over lubricate this, but I'm going to say it's difficult. This rifle likes a lot of lube. I'm also going to take my cleaning patch and I'm going to put a light coat on my charging handle. Then I'm going to drop some more into the upper receiver. Put the charging handle in, not all the way. Wipe a little more in here with our cleaning patch. And then put our bolt carrier group back in place. And in the interest of brevity off camera, I'll put a patch with CLP down the bore and use another patch with CLP to put a light coat on the exposed steel parts. And now we're going to do a function check. Now, even though I've just been cleaning this rifle for the last half hour, the first thing of the function check is to lock the bolt to the rear and look in the chamber and make sure that it's empty. Now I'm going to let the bolt go forward, put the rifle on safe, pull the trigger, and nothing should happen. Rotate the selector to fire, pull the trigger, and hold it, and you should hear a click. While holding it, cycle the action again. Now let off the trigger, and for lack of a better term, you should hear a thunk. Pull the trigger again, you should hear a click. There's your function check. And so, of course, now I'm going to, out of habit, check, let the bolt go forward, put the selector on safe, close the dust cover. Now let's clean another firearm. Now let's clean the Beretta 92 FS. Now when I clean this, I will use powder solvent on at least some parts of it. But when I'm using powder solvent, I don't want to put my brush directly into this bottle and get some of the residue in the bottle. So I'm going to put the solvent in this cup. And I'll put enough in there. I think I've got enough to do the job. And then I'll put the lid back on this and make sure it's secure. Set that somewhere out of the way. Now when I'm working on this barrel, the first thing I'm going to do is use this bore brush. And I'm going to use some powder solvent. And I'm going to hold it out here so when the brush comes out the end of the bore and sprays solvent all over the place, not quite so much of it gets on me. And because this is a plastic bore brush, I'm not as worried as I was with the rifle about putting it through the barrel both directions. Then I'm going to take my brush, get some solvent on it, and clean around the chamber and around the exterior parts of the barrel. Now the thing with powder solvent is that it does dissolve some of the residue. It gets a lot of it off there, but now that residue didn't disintegrate, it's still there, it's just in the solution of the powder solvent. And so to get the powder solvent off, I'll clean that with soap and water. The same thing with the slide. Get some powder solvent on there, get a lot of this. But I'm not going to put the slide into the soapy water solution because some of it will end up getting inside here and it could take a long time to get that water out. So I'm going to scrub this and pay special attention to scrubbing the face of the bolt. That's a part that absolutely must be clean. And again, I'm abbreviating this to some degree. Now there's some grooves in here that it's difficult to get the brush into. And so to do that, I'll use a cleaning patch, something like the eyelet on the rod, and that gets it into that groove. And we'll get the residue out of it. And again, to clean the solvent off of this, get the solvent off my brush in the soapy water. And you can see my brush isn't black anymore because the solvent cleaned all the powder residue off the brush. And I'll use soap and water to get rid of all of this. Now, men, there's a thing I'm going to say to you. Some men really like the smell of powder solvent. I'm going to tell you that virtually no women like the smell of it. I once had a man told me that if he could get aftershave that smelled like powder solvent, he would wear it. Well, got a feeling if he did, he'd remain single. At home, when I store this bottle of powder solvent, I keep it outside. Even though the lid is securely on it, I still keep it outside. And notice I'm using this disposable cup. It will be disposed of. And now that I've got a lot of that washed off, again, I'm not going to submerge it in the water, but I am going to come over here to a jug and rinse it off. Get all of that off of there. Then I'm going to use this red t-shirt to dry it off. Using this t-shirt that I got from Goodwill means that I don't have to use any of the nice towels from home. That can score you some points. And I can recycle this later when a meat target wears it. Now, as far as the frame of the pistol, this is aluminum, and I am just going to use soap and water on this. And I will, at least in part, dip this in the soapy water solution. And I'll scrub it. And it's very important to scrub these pieces where the slide comes in contact with the frame. This is the part that absolutely must be clean. But I'm going to get down in the mag well and so on. And again, I can use the eyelet on the cleaning rod and a patch to get into some of the places that the brush can't reach. A place that often gets neglected is behind the hammer right here. There's a surprising amount of residue, grime that we can get right there. And, just like the rifle, we'll go back to the jug and rinse it off. Now, the reason I keep this jug over here is because if it was sitting on the table next to me, I'd end up rinsing myself just about as much as the pistol. And shake some of the water out of that, dry it off with my t-shirt, and again, set that in the sun to dry for a while. Now our pistol is dried. I've got some CLP on my patch. Lube the bore. Got some CLP on our larger patch. Lube the outside of the barrel. In lubing the slide, I'm going to drop some drops of CLP in here. Got to make sure you get CLP in the grooves where that's going to meet the frame. Take my patch and lube the outside of it. Now, as far as the frame, yeah, I put the cap back on out of habit. I'm going to hit some drops here where the frame comes in contact with the slide, and I'm going to put some in the hammer and trigger assemblies. And out of habit, put the cap back on. And then I'll use the patch to wipe some of this around. And then we'll reassemble the pistol. Since I've already lubricated the slide, got to be careful when putting it back on the pistol. Then I'm going to work the slide a few times, and then we'll do a function check. I'll lower the hammer, leave the trigger deactivator engaged. When I pull the trigger, nothing should happen. So re-engage the trigger. Now when I pull the trigger, it should cycle. And I will continue holding the trigger to the rear cycle the action, the hammer will stay back. When I release the trigger, you should hear the thunk. Pull the trigger again, and it will go off. And there's your function check. And that's cleaning the 92FS. Let's try one more handgun. And now let's clean our Smith & Wesson Model 638. And like the Beretta, I'm going to use powder solvent for this. I've already dumped this out and cleaned it, so we'll put some more powder solvent in there, an amount I think sufficient to do the job. And put the cap back on tightly, get that out of the way. With a revolver is where a bore brush like this can become really handy. Get some powder solvent on there and just go through all of our chambers. And I'm going to clean the chambers multiple times. Now, revolvers are traditionally known for being more reliable than autoloaders, although today's generation of autoloaders are extremely reliable. But when a revolver does have some kind of malfunction, it often has to do with putting rounds into the chamber that don't just slide in like they should because your chambers are dirty. I'm going to be especially diligent about cleaning the chambers. Then, of course, I can use the same brush to clean the bore. Now, I was talking about cleaning the bore going from the chamber to the muzzle. This is what I mean, that some firearms just don't really allow you to do that. Then I'm going to use my brush, some powder solvent on it, and clean the frame. And a lot of residue will be in this frame, especially around the forcing cone and the firing pin. And I'm going to hold the muzzle down so I don't get a lot of this inside the frame of the pistol. Yes, some people will say it's not a pistol, it's a revolver. A long time ago I looked in a dictionary, and under the definition of revolver, the definition was, a revolver is a pistol, and then it goes on to explain the particulars about it. Although it may be technically correct to say revolver and not pistol. If that's the biggest thing you can find to complain about, you lead a charmed life. And now, like we did with the Beretta, once I get all that powder solvent on there and all that's nasty, I'm going to clean my brush with soap and water and clean the revolver with soap and water. Some people will argue that you can excessively clean the chambers. Remember, this is a plastic brush, not a wire brush. And as we saw before, the powder solvent is really good for getting powder residue off the toothbrush as well. And I'm just going to clean this. Hold it muzzle down. And now we'll go to the jug of water and rinse it. I want to avoid getting water inside the frame, so I'm going to put my thumb over this. Just rinse. I can also use our brush in the rinsing process. And this creates enough of a mess that sometimes cleaning your firearms outside is the right way to go. And now let's dry it off. Now our revolver is dried, and let's lube it. Do I have to? Okay. He said lube. Okay. So we'll put some CLP on our patch. Put the cap back on out of habit. And just run that patch through the chambers. Run the same patch through the bore. I'm also going to push the ejector rod and put a couple of drops of CLP on that. And I'm going to put just a drop behind the hammer, 2 drops. Cock the hammer, put a couple of drops in front of the hammer. Then work the action a few times. Now that we've done that, we're finished. But there's something very important I have to point out about this revolver. Anytime people see a close-up of it, a lot of people will notice that the grip looks really chewed up, and there are questions as to why. And the answer is, when I first got this revolver, that grip had enough dimension to it that I couldn't get the HKS speed loader to fit in there so I could load the revolver. So using very high-tech equipment, namely a pocket knife and a cigarette lighter, I carved out enough of that so that now the HKS speed loader fits in there very easily. So to recap, powder solvent, then wash that out with soap and water, let dry, then lube. Or when not using powder solvent, use household cleaner, make sure you get the right one, and or soap and water, let dry, lube. Always remember function check at the end. So if you've sat through this entire presentation, thank you for your attention, and thanks for watching the Basics of Firearms Cleaning video.